All right, Jack. So I just watched Prototype and it was um, amazing. It was wonderful. Um, I did not watch the last 15 minutes, so luckily I won't be able to give any spoilers. But I have plenty of questions anyways. Um,
Okay, that's good resistance there, not to watch the last 15 minutes. It
I
all flipped round in the last 15 minutes.
I wanted to ask, first of
Mm.
all, when you were putting this together, how did you decide exactly how you wanted one and two to look like?
That's very good. So the prosthetics for the masks that were produced, had kind of already been before I got involved. We were already ordered; they were already there. So we were literally given a choice of the range. And I don't. I think if you look at both of them, I think one is is more human. It's more of a complete face, whereas the as two has is more sort of got elements that are some, something going
Sorry, sorry.
on.
Sorry,
That's
I
okay.
promise I am listening to you. The light turned off, and I'm trying to. I was just trying to get it turned back
You're
on.
doing a very good job.
Just
Um,
pointing on the screen instead of on the side of it. All right,
That's
my
okay. I'm
bad,
usually
brother.
like monitoring a cat or something in the background. So if you see me go like this, it's because the cat's coming. Yeah. So looking at the mask, I think you can see that one is more of a human face,
Yeah,
whereas two has got more of a robotic elements to it. But it really was the actors that I mean, it's so hard to act in these masks. They're not proper prosthetics. They're not sort of parts on a face that actors can actually sort of emote. It was all on body motions, the head movements, the way they delivered the lines, the eyes. And it was really due respect to Zoe and to Luke, who really managed to act in these masks, which was not easy. At one point, we were thinking that we were going to sort of blend in or blend out the eyes.
yeah.
If you look at Zero at the beginning of the film, he has red, blocked out eyes, and we were going to do that throughout the whole film. But you can emote so much through the eyes, and we just felt we were losing so much if we were getting rid of the actor's eyes or sort of doing some sort of CGI with the eyes. And you'd be really hard as an audience to be able to engage with those characters, and it was so important. So we decided to keep it in. And they have their actual eyes. So some people may sort of say, oh, but they've got human eyes. But I think it's an artistic license in that respect because I think they managed to portray so much through their eyes. So it was all due respect to them, really. They were the ones that brought the characters to life.
And I like how the lips are done as well.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
but the actors in the prosthetics, then the two that you just name dropped, they are also the ones that are delivering the lines and actually speaking.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
They obviously delivered the lines on set. And at one point we were thinking we'd probably just keep that audio in because it was recorded well. They can actually talk quite well with the prosthetics on. And so there wasn't necessarily a need to sort of overdub them. But actually what I wanted to do is I wanted to be a slight disconnect from them and the way they said their lines. So we did ADR all of their lines. So in post-production, they then re-recorded all of their lines. So then it was clearer and we could then modulate them and make them sound a little bit more artificial or whatever. But it also was that slight disconnect because although a robot is moving its mouth, it doesn't necessarily mean that the words would be coming out like a human does. So it just helps to give that sort of a slightly more robotic look. But they did a great performance and they obviously had that performance on set to be able to reference. And then they could listen back to that and say, okay, what motivation did I have for that particular scene? But yeah, again, kudos to them because they did a great job in terms of giving performances both on the set and in post production as well.
Now, when it comes to the actual actors and their voices and
Mm-hmm.
the sound of their voices and the delivery, was that part of the casting process and why these two were cast the way that they talk?
Um, Not specifically. No, I mean I think it was all about the main thing we looked at was they both have backgrounds in performance and movement, and I think they've both done stunt work as well. So they were all very good and very familiar with how they use their body and how their body would come across, different movements. That was more important than their specific voices, because in the end we could have overdubbed them with a different actor, or
True.
something. We could have just got we could have got someone with some real gravitas to give a particular performance if we wanted the robot to sound like that. But we were so pleased with the way that their voices sounded and how they were conveying on camera, that we thought at first we'll just use that. And then it was only in post-production that actually let's have that disconnect, but still use the same actors, because they did such an amazing job. So, and I think also, I don't know if it's common knowledge, but Zoe and Luke are actually a couple in real life. So they had that instant chemistry, which or instant sort of butting, in like
That's
any
funny.
relationship. But it was there isn't. I don't know if they mind. I mean, I haven't spoken to them to find out if they mind me telling anybody, but I think it's a really interesting dynamic, because they have that sort of instant familiarity with each other, which I think technology, if you had, I mean, robots aren't quite there yet, but I think if a robot, or Alexa seems to know your whole house when you plug her in.
Right.
So I should turn off Alexa on my
Yeah.
when she starts over the
Otherwise,
door.
she's gonna be talking behind you.
But they had that instant connection, which also meant they had a lot of when they did the choreography of the fighting and stuff like that. They had that time to be able to do that in advance. So I do think that really helps them with their character. They were a couple, but that wasn't an intention at the very beginning. I think initially we cast Luke, who had been in another film, and he'd suggested Zoe, and we thought, great, let's bring her in. And she was brilliant. She was really, I couldn't think of two better people to play those parts now in the end.
Was there a specific coordinator, not necessarily a stunt coordinator, but movement coordinator for for 1 and 2?
They were their own coordinators,
Because of their
which was,
background?
they had that background, and they sent me sort of self tapes of them doing the stunt choreography, how they were going to do different movements, how they were going to react to different things. We looked at a lot of different references from sort of big films, Terminator. We have a series in the UK called Humans, on which is on terrestrial. But again, that kind of that although they're very human in that, that element of that slight disconnect. So we did reference a lot of these things, and we did discuss all of these different references when we were planning. But it really was their own body movements, and that really was the sort of selling point for them, because they knew exactly what they were doing. They've all done stunt work themselves, but they're very familiar with exactly what they do, and they were so professional in terms of how they were going to interact with each other, that I really had a really easy job in that sense. That was the least of my issues on the set.
Well, when it came to upgrading two, like, and how the differences were displayed between 1 and 2, were there any pieces that you guys were considering including in 2 that you ended up kind of pulling back because it made her too overpowered, or basically was really not part of what you were trying to portray?
I think no, I don't think at any point I ever really sort of said I didn't sound like I did very much with these two actors, did it? Because they kind of had it off pat straight to start with. They came with me with suggestions at the very beginning. How evil do we want to make her? But because you have the instant facade of a robot, they can't be sort of like a mega villain. They can't be doing sort of little, sort of mini they can't be sort of
Which
it's
almost
all
works better and looks better
yes,
in the
exactly.
way.
It's all stripped back anyway. And so what they did give was just a very sort of it's unnerving, because it's just very sort of subtle. It's very like we don't have to sort of don't have to run around after you. We don't have to like run and scare you. We literally can just react straight away. So there didn't need to be much dialing back, to be honest. I think Zoe did an amazing job. She's fantastic in this. Because I say it was not easy for the actors at all. They were literally in those masks all day, every day. They were hot. They were not easy to work in. The peripheral vision wasn't great on them, so it was difficult. So I think they did a really good job. But yeah, everything. I think if it comes across as creepy and disconcerting, that's probably because they were uncomfortable and annoyed and just generally unhappy.
Well, besides those actors, then I was curious because when it comes to child actors, it's a very interesting casting process, and the direction of the child. I was curious how that actress was chosen, and if uh, a child actress like in that type of film needs specific direction.
Sure. I mean, I've worked quite a few times with a number of different child actors, and Marshall is really interesting. So Marshall has worked on a couple of films with the same production company, but I hadn't ever worked with them before. And when Marshall was cast, I was like, they're really interesting because although they're very young, they probably haven't sort of developed their identity yet. Their parents are they're very much like gender non-binary. So we were kind of like, at first, the character of Andy was always written as a little boy. It's just a little boy, and it says he and brother, and it's all sort of the two boys, Michael and Andy. But then when Marshall came on board, because although he was born male, his parents are very sort of open in terms of like they're sort of not really pigeonholing in terms of his gender. And I was like, well, why not? Why does it? It doesn't matter that he's a little boy or a little girl. It's not relevant to the story particularly. Why don't we just include that in it so that so they pronouns is always tricky, but so that they
Sure.
are not. So Andy could be a male or a female name. I gave him free reign. I gave them free reign to bring whatever toys they wanted to. So they brought a range of things so they had the Barbies. So people instantly think Barbie girl, but then he also had like dinosaur and other toys as well. Some of his clothes were some of their clothes were more sort of pinks and pastels. Some of their clothes were more sort of blues. When they go to school, they're actually wearing shorts, and it's a boys' school uniform. But I thought it was really interesting. Like at the end of the day, it doesn't make any difference to the story. It makes it really interesting, and I always thought it was quite a good dynamic because at the end of the day, robots aren't male or female really. We apportionate that to them, and even at the very beginning, you see that two is sort of like we'll change the voice from male to female, and
Right.
instantly the faces could be male or female. And obviously, Zoe played two, but it could have easily that part could have easily been played by a man. So we thought, well, it's interesting. It's an interesting dichotomy in there, and I think it's better that although I'm not a big fan of just tokenism, like let's just crowbar that in for the sake of it. I thought, well, why not? There's no relevance to the story and whether it's a male or a female character. I'm all for sort of inclusivity. Let's make the character gender non-binary. And see where it goes. So there is one mention in the whole film where I think the mum says, "Go to your brother," and it was a mistake that we meant to change because we changed all of the pronouns. But actually, we thought, well, let's leave it in because pronouns are tricky. Instantly,
Mhm.
you think even for parents with a child that's that is non-binary would probably say that occasionally because they're obviously maybe used to it, or with family members they may. So we kind of thought, well, let's leave that in for a bit of authenticity. We could have just changed it, but yeah. So it's interesting that interesting. Most people have sort of said, oh, the little girl, and actually sort of it's interesting that sort of I always think he presents more as a little boy, but then maybe that's because I know. But,
So
but anyway,
it's
a little bit of background there.
that's so interesting. Like I never would have guessed that. I thought that they were a little girl, but
Yeah,
I
I mean,
think that
you instantly see long hair, you see a little doll, and you make, especially at that age, they haven't gone through puberty, they haven't, the voice isn't broken or anything like that. Certainly on set presents more tomboy, but it's really again it blurs the lines, and again it just shows that it's really not a specific, it doesn't have to be a specific portrayal one way or the other. So I just thought it was quite an interesting way of doing it, and I think I'm pleased that we did.
well, I think what's really cool is a huge dynamic of this film is between their character and one.
Mm.
And like you said, the parallels there of one wouldn't see them as a male or a female, just sees them as a human being.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. They
that's
have none of
like,
those preconceptions built in at all. They will only learn that from whoever programs them.
yes.
Same as us as humans, all of us, we get programmed things as we grow up. So yeah, again, it was just a really interesting way of doing it. And we thought, let's look at the script, see if there's any changes that need to be made. And there wasn't one single change we had to make apart from the odd pronoun here and there. It really didn't make any difference to the story. The relationships are still exactly the same. It's a child and their robot and family dynamics and things. So I think it's a really interesting element that I'm pleased we left in.
Awesome. So to the sci-fi element, obviously it's in the future. When you think of that, are you able to say like what kind of what kind of like a range of around the time, like after 2050 or like after 30 something, or is that
I,
something that you just kind of leave open to the
we did leave it. We left it open. I always thought that it was in the near future. I think these are prototypes. These are, these aren't something that's commonly on the market at the moment. The father is the inventor, and I think if you looked around and explored, there are certain levels of this technology, maybe not quite as up there at the moment, but certainly, there are prototypes for things that are far more advanced than are actually custom, actually out on the market. And I think if you just think back
100%?
20 years, 30 years, it's night and day as far as the technology. So it literally could be 20, 30 years. I imagine within our lifetime. So I always thought it was in our lifetime. We tried not to have too much in there that like dated the house or dated the location. The fashions was all kind of kept relatively straightforward. So as not to sort of say, well, this is very specifically this time period. We didn't try and go for like futuristic, like Google glasses, or to be fair, Google glasses would be an indication of how dated it would be, because people maybe like 5 years ago were like, yes, Google glasses are a thing, and then suddenly they're just not a thing. No one's using Google, so no one's really on their phones particularly. It was all sort of in the near future. So I was thinking it could be something that could happen in the next 5 to 10 years, but I think in reality it would be somewhere more like maybe 30, 40 years.
Yeah,
I'd like a little home robot.
well, yeah, and with the technology advancement, it advances at an accelerating rate. So, like instead of
It's
10
scary.
years, it's going to be 5 years. Yeah, but back to again, prototype. As far as when you were initially putting together the movie, when you finally started, like obviously you were in production, when you finally started filming, like actually on set, was that pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, during pandemic? Well, can't say
Yeah.
post-pandemic, but yeah,
I know
you
what you mean.
understand.
Yeah. It's funny because I've made quite a few films over the last few years, and in my mind I'm thinking all of them as like pre, during, or post pandemic. And yes, you're right, we're not quite post yet, but I think certainly in the UK we've lifted most restrictions and things like that. So it seems like we're coming out of the end of it. But this was shot during, but the planning was done right at the very beginning. So it was kind of touch and go as to whether we'd be able to make it. Should we delay? Were there going to be restrictions on actors, on cast, on crew, locations, facilities, things like that? And in the end, it actually we made quite a few films during lockdown, and we found it, as long as you were small and independent crews. Luckily, we're small. We're quite sort of responsive. We can change. Sort of, we're not like a big huge machine that needs to then sort of change location is really tricky. We could be really adaptive. So it actually really helped. We made a lot of films during lockdown because we had access to locations that maybe we wouldn't be able to have access to normally, because they were either being closed down because hotels couldn't be used for visitors, so therefore we could use some of those. Some other locations would usually be hired out to much bigger productions, but they couldn't work, so we were in there. And we were only there for I think we were shooting for maybe a week, 2 weeks. So it really was a sort of a short period of time. We were all in one location mainly. Maybe there's a couple of smaller locations, but we found that it was actually easier to shoot during lockdown, as long as we were sort of accommodating to how tricky it could be. I mean, we did have issues, although the cast was great in terms of we had everybody that we would cast, and then everybody stayed. There was no one got sick or anything like that. Crew wise, it was tricky. we lost people after a couple of days. We had to replace people after a couple of days, and then we had new crew in, and then we had to replace those and have new crew in. So that was the hardest part, was that we didn't know who was going to turn up on one day. And it's always really tricky if when you're shooting a film, you get that sort of, it takes a day or two for people to cement, to work out how people are going to work together. It's like a family at the end of it. But if you have only a two or 3 days with someone and then they disappear and then you get someone else, you have to rebuild those relationships again, which is always so tricky. So it was hard in some areas, but yeah, we got there in the end. But it was tricky. But this was shot at the end of 2020, so that's coming up to a year and a half ago now. So
And
nice that
that
it's finally getting out there.
it's probably a lot easier with a minimalist cast, like the way that you guys do. I mean, there's seems to be essentially like less than 10 people on a regular
Yeah.
basis. Um, had you ever considered a point where instead of just two being brought in, being like 2 and 3 and 4, and then two showing why they're superior? Um, is that something that was considered, or was it always about 1 and 2 and the dynamic between the generation, just one generation gap?
I think it, like every film you ever do, and I think this is probably true of like even the biggest productions, is that there's always things you think, this is what I would love to do if I had infinite resources, infinite money, infinite time. I would love to show the grand scale of how this organization was planning on bringing these robots out. And then you're thinking in the realms of, you know, AI or Minority Report, or, you know, big budget future things. You know, your mind could go crazy, but then that takes you away from the actual story, which is this family unit. And I think if you start expanding that too much out, it stops becoming this story about family and starts becoming much more about, this is the future. And I mean, I love science fiction films. They're absolutely the best. And you know, when you have a big budget and you can do huge, great big special effects and things like that, awesome. I'd love to do that. But at the same time, you would lose something, I think, from having sort of this story, which is much more rooted in family. So yeah, there are elements that I would like. Exactly, it's all about these characters and giving each of these characters a lot more time to actually interact with each other, have periods of dialogue, which maybe you'd have a lot more running around and shooting and more drama in terms of action. This time you can have more drama in terms of relationships, their interactions with each other, which I think is nice. But that doesn't mean to say that in the future I'd like to do a prototypes too, because at the end of the film we actually were planning on having a sequence which was explaining what was happening with the rest of the program. The program was going to be when they were all packing. Well, you haven't seen the end of the film, you see. But
sorry, this morning I was delayed. Go ahead.
It's okay. It's exciting stuff. But we were thinking that at the end we'd have a sequence that would show that actually the program is still carrying on. They're still planning on bringing out new robots. That there might be some sort of, you know, news announcement that they've brought in safeguards or something like that, but still to indicate to the audience that this program is still carrying on. It's not just finished and done and it was a mistake and it's finished, because technology doesn't do that anyway. Big companies make mistakes, airplanes fall out of the sky and they go, oh, sorry about that, we fixed it now. And they don't go, right, we're grounding all flights now forever, or when we're taking that technology off the market, we'll fix it, but there's too much invested, the machine is already going. These big companies aren't going to turn around and go, oh, actually, sorry, we made a mistake there. We'll just shelve that £1 million investment or £1 billion investments because we think it's a bad idea. We'll go, no, we'll still keep going because we've invested all that money. So I generally think that we've left it up to in this version of the film, we've left it up to the audience to decide what happens. But certainly some of the robots are still around. I won't tell you who, but certainly there's the indication that that's still continuing on. So there could be a prototype too if this is successful. Who knows? And then maybe that has a slightly bigger scale to it. I'd be interested to see that.
Yeah, and if you were to do that, do you think it would be less character driven and maybe a little bit of a different mesh for sci-fi, maybe sci-fi with more action, or sci-fi with different characters in a different setting?
I think it's interesting. You could do both. You could do it. You could either. Or. I mean, if you think of say big famous films like you had Alien, which was very much people on a spacecraft, and it was all very sort of contained. And then you had Aliens, which just went way big. Let's get the army and let's get more people in. Let's make it huge. And that really worked because you still had the the key characters in there. I mean, the dynamic between Ridley and Newton in Aliens, for example, is really interesting. It keeps the heart and soul of the film. So I think if we did do a prototype 2, we'd have to make sure this family unit is still the heart of the film. But I'd love to do something on a bigger scale, something with more scope, showing the technology, that how it's involved. Because I love seeing future films, because I love seeing how that future technology is integrated into our world, how people are changing, how people are using that technology differently. So I'd love to be able to show more of that. I think at the moment we because of the budgets we had, I think we were very much like, let's focus on this technology, but we didn't have, sort of minority report screens and stuff like that. We didn't really show what TVs they were using, what apps they were using on their phones and things like that. So I'd love to show more of that world, but at the same time keeping it rooted in the family.
That's really cool. So I want to know if there were any projects that you had in the past. Obviously, like you've name dropped a lot of huge inspirations for you, big movies, big international properties, big IPs.
Sure.
What about your own projects? Were there anything in your own projects that inspired this idea for Prototype?
No, this is actually kind of this film stands out a little bit, which is probably why it's one of my favorites of the films that I've directed, because a lot of films I have done have been sort of lower budget horror films. There's usually sort of in the vein of Scream or sort of Friday the 13th, something like that. There's usually sort of someone running around trying to kill someone else. So this was quite nice that you still had elements of that, and we still tried to like have it that the audience could still be sort of shocked, but it wasn't all about that. There wasn't all about because you knew who the killer was right throughout the whole thing. She was there, right there, talking to everybody in amongst the family, and that's creepier that she's right there. Everybody knows who she is, and so you didn't have to have her running around and things in after the family. But
At
so
least
it's
it was
tricky.
nice that were still number 2 is still grabbing the knives, and there was slasher pieces.
Yeah,
So
that's all the things.
was a
At
little
what point
bit.
is she gonna snap? Is she? Yeah, it's literally we were toying with the audiences to sort of see, at what point are you thinking, is she gonna do? No, nothing. She's okay now. Like what point is she gonna do something? So yeah, so my previous, this was actually the first, although it's coming out now.
Right.
This is the first feature film I directed, which is kind of weird thinking back, because I think I'm now done about 7 or 8 feature films, and we're just in post production for a couple at the moment. So this is kind of weird because this was the first one, and although it's come out way later because of COVID and because of different things, some things just took a long time to get through that post production process, and other films just came out really quickly. I think the one thing about COVID was that certainly distributors got an idea about which films were selling. And so there was like, right, we need horror, quickly make horror films. Let's get any horror films we've got out there. Okay, dramas. Okay, let's see. We're not quite sure yet. They'll take a little bit longer. And I think because this one's going out it's going to be on iTunes. It's on Amazon, April the 5th, everybody, in case I've been given the details, I have to say. Although it's only in America and Canada at the moment, though. So you Americans and Canadians, you get there first, always. Even though I'm here in the UK, I'd like to see the film. But yeah, so it was weird because this was the first one I made, and so it was I didn't have a lot of references apart from my own loves of films that I was brought up in the films of the 80s and the 90s. Which Terminator is a really good example. It's a film I constantly go back to because it's so brilliantly made, but it's on a relatively small budget with a very much the guerrilla style of filmmaking. That James Cameron was running around sort of shooting stuff in LA, but he hadn't got the proper permissions and stuff like that. Just like quickly get that shot. That's that I'm not saying that we would ever do things without permission, but with that same mentality, you just like, well, quickly get the shot. Let's just quickly do that. Let's quickly just do this scene here. We've got access to this great building at the moment. Let's quickly shoot this on here. And that guerrilla filmmaking is something that I really love. And I think that's what I try and bring to all of my films. So one day maybe I'll have £1 million films, but I'll still be there sneaking shots in the background, trying to get every buck out of every shot out of the minimal budget. So
Well, I was gonna ask, if you wanted to name drop anything that you have coming up out after Prototype. You have a
sure.
ton of projects, so if there's a couple that you want to name or name drop.
Well, I've name dropped one because I'm literally editing it at the moment, so it's really in my head. I've come off the editing suite to speak to you, and then I'm going to go back to it. So we shot a film called Ghost Flight really recently. It's right at the tail end of COVID, and we had access to a really great location. And Ghost Flights, I couldn't believe that there isn't a film called Ghost Flight, as far as I can tell, not according to IMDb. But Ghost Flights are real flights. They're the flights that airlines do between airports to get their planes to a different destination before they then need to do a scheduled flight. So they fly empty. There's 27,000 of these empty flights
Really?
every year. It's crazy, and they're called
I
Ghost
didn't
Flights.
even know about them.
No, but I was like, Ghost Flight, what a great name for a film. Let's quickly make a film. We've got access to these great locations. So we made this really great it's basically a haunted house film on a plane is the greatest summary for that. So that should be coming out later this year. It's called Ghost Flight. I'm super excited about it. But yeah, ask me once I finish editing it as to how it's gone. We've shot it. It looks amazing. But now to turn like 300 shots into a film is the next battle. But yeah, I'm super stoked for it. I think it's really exciting. It's a really good one.
All right, before I let you get back to working on Ghost Flight, is
Thanks.
there anything else that you want to mention about Prototype or give any shout outs for the people that worked with you on the film?
I think I would. Yeah, I mean, obviously we've spoken about Zoe and Luke did a great job as the two robots, and we spoke a little bit about Marshall and how great he was as as they were as a young actor, because you couldn't face them. Anything you would throw at them, they would literally just be so calm, as though the crew and the cast would be running around, be maniac, and they're just like, oh, it's fine. So maybe sometimes just being that naive is really good. But then I think Danielle and Jamie were really stand out, obviously, as Roger and Shelley. I think their relationship, and especially Jamie, I think in talking about menacing performances when you don't actually sort of go around shouting or going around fighting or sort of being really dramatic, just being really facially not someone we want to mess with. I think very like similar to like Kevin Spacey type demonic. There's something
Right,
not quite right there between the eyes.
right. If they're
But it's
able to express a lot,
yeah,
technically expressing dialogue without speaking,
yes. There's a whole
advancing the
scene that we
story with faces.
absolutely. There's a scene that we kept in, and the producers weren't sure, because it was the bit where he does up the tie. The robot's doing up his tie, and he's just keeping
Yeah.
an eye on his wife. And we played the whole scene in real time. And some of the producers were like, oh, I think it's too long. We just need to cut to it, blah, blah, blah. I was like, no, it's creepy. It's creepy. He's just there getting his tie done up. He's literally just looking at his wife. And you can feel the tension building throughout that whole scene. I loved it. I thought it's a really menacing, it's a really creepy thing, because you don't get that on film. It's all constantly something happening. So that, well, let's summarize people's relationship in one scene, in this
And
creepy scene. So
I
I hope
think it
people like
works that he put it on underneath the coat too. That way you can't see if whether it was too short or whether or not.
that.
So it worked out perfectly.
It's all part of the plan. Yeah. No, but apart from that, I think that's pretty much all I can talk about. I mean, I could probably talk about the films I'm doing, and hopefully have me on for future. When Ghost Flight comes out, maybe you'll get me back to talk about that one as well. I hope you'll enjoy that one. But yeah, hope you enjoy the last 15 minutes of
I definitely will.
it.
Thank you so much for coming on today.
No
Any
problem at
last
all.
thing that you want to say to your viewers and reader?
No, I mean, I was going to say, like, it would be useful to certainly I'd love to know your Instagram handles and stuff like that. I haven't been given any background, so anybody that's been speaking to, because I'd love to do posts and shout outs and stuff like that. So my Instagram is at Jack Peter Mundy. So give me a follow, and then I can follow you back. If anybody wants to follow me, at Jack Peter Mundy on Instagram is probably the best one, because it's so good, because I'm all about the visuals. So Instagram is perfect for me, because I just put on the latest visuals, the latest trailers, the latest images from my films. And then people can message you and stuff like that as well. So I think that's the best one.
Nice. All right.
Lovely.
Well, it's been awesome, and make sure
Thank you so much for
safe.
having me. I really appreciate it. And now I've got to go and do another one.